the topic of cities, the challenge of cities, is in some sense the great challenge of our age. What I've shown behind is one way of thinking about the mass urbanization of the world. So each one of those bars shows the share of countries in each income group that is more than 1/3 urban. 1/3 is relatively arbitrary, but it's meant to convey a society that has become relatively connected in urban spaces. What you can see is that if I go back to 1960, and 1960 is shown by the blue lines, look at the between $4,000 and $5,000. In 1960, 80% of the countries with per capita incomes in modern dollars between 4,000 and 5,000 were more than 1/3 urban. Brazil was actually between 2,000 and 3,000. So it would have been one of the countries that was more than 1/3 urbanized as of 1960, as of course Brazil became 1/2 urban in 1964, when its per capita income was just a bit over $2,000 in modern dollars. But the big change occurs in the poorest parts of the world. What share of countries with per capita incomes below $1,000 were more than 1/3 urban in 1960? It's a really easy number for all of you to remember. The number is 0, not a 1. Because in 1960, as had been true throughout almost all of human history, to be poor was to be rural. Today, more than 40% of these poorest countries are more than 1/3 urban. We've seen mass urbanization in places that are unbelievably poor. You know, I was walking around Vidigal 2 days ago, and given the work that I've been doing in Africa, my first reaction was, my goodness, this place is rich. And so you have mass urbanization in places that are both poor and often poorly governed. One of the points, in fact, the main point of this talk, is that the challenges of dealing with this urbanization is in some sense, it may be the most important task of the 21st century. And it is a task at which Brazilians are ideally positioned, because this country experienced urbanization when it was still reasonably poor. And consequently, when Africa looks for guidance for how to urbanize in the 21st century, it should not be looking north to London, which went through these experiences 200 years ago. Right? It should be looking instead to the west. It should be looking to Brazil. Now, I often think about cities as being characterized by a triad of 3 things. The first leg of that triad, shown up there, which is a marketplace in Old Jerusalem, is the magic of social interactions in cities. It's the fact that we can trade in cities. It's the fact that we can work together in cities. It's the fact that in urban areas, in dense urban areas, as the English economist Alfred Marshall wrote more than 100 years ago, the mysteries of the trade become no mystery, but are, as it were, in the air. The fact that we learn so much from people who are close to us. And that is not being changed by new technologies at all, right? The more complicated the world is, the easier it is for ideas to get lost in translation, right? Anyone who's ever taught knows the hard thing about teaching is not knowing your subject material, it's knowing whether anything you're saying is getting through. And face-to-face contact, that contact that is enabled by cities, helps to make that happen, helps to enable us to learn from one another. The second part of this triad, and you see down here, this is an image of Boston after the bombing at the Marathon, are the demons that come with density. When 2 people are close enough to exchange an idea face-to-face, they're also close enough to give each other a contagious disease. And if someone is close enough to sell you a magazine, they're close enough to rob you. Right? And for thousands of years, cities have been trying to battle the demons that come with density. And this requires a robust public sector. A robust public sector combined with NGOs, with non-governmental organizations, to actually manage the public commons, to manage interactions between people in a way that eliminates it from being harmful. The third leg of this triad is the physical city. It's the built environment, which, when people think of city skylines, they sometimes think that the buildings are all the city on. They are not. And the buildings ultimately always exist to be in service to the people that use them. But of course, those buildings are crucial. Those buildings actually enable the cities to function, and the infrastructure that is absolutely vital as well. Whenever we are tempted to give up seeing the awful things that can happen in the cities that are the poorest parts of the world, we have to remember that there is no path out of poverty into prosperity that does not run through city streets. What you're seeing here is urbanization in 1960 along the x-axis, and per capita growth between 1960 and 2010 along the y-axis. I am not saying here, this graph does not imply that we should force people into cities at all. But you cannot look at this graph and think the right answer is to stop people from coming to cities. Right? Cities are deeply associated with the process of economic development. When you compare those countries in the world that are more than one-half urbanized to those countries that are less than one-half urbanized, the more urbanized countries have incomes that are on average 5 times higher, and infant mortality levels that are less than 1/3 the less urbanized countries. This is also true within countries. So this is from a recent paper of mine comparing the US, Brazil, India, and China. This is the relationship between the size of agglomeration and incomes. If anything, the link between urbanization and income is stronger in India, China, and Brazil than it is the US. I will say one other thing because it is an important theme. It's not one that I will stress throughout the rest of the talk. But the great determinant of urban success in all of these countries is education. Right? Education is the bedrock on which urban growth lasts. It determines how prosperous the city is. It determines how fast it grows in terms of income and population. And this is, if anything, far more true in the developing world than it is in the United States. Cities are often seen as being places where you can get rich, but also places that destroy quality of life, that destroy the human spirit itself. Certainly people like Gandhi, who famously regarded the growth of cities as an evil thing, bad for mankind and the world, would have probably accepted the point that cities are associated with wealth, but claimed that cities do other terrible things which more than offset those advantages. That's not what the data says. When we look at self-reported life satisfaction, how happy people are with their lives. Now what you see is in the wealthy world, there's basically no difference between city and country in this. Some places like Sweden favors the urbanites, some places like New Zealand favors the rural dwellers. But when you go to the poorest parts of the world, particularly, somewhat ironically, above all India, happiness strongly favors urban living. Which does not tell you that, again, we should not be pushing people out of farms into cities. But you cannot look at data like this and think that Gandhi was right, that we should somehow or other stop, if we ever could, and we can't, the urbanization of India. This is a place where there is a future. And a mistake that we often make, that Westerners, that the wealthy often make when they go to an Indian slum, is they see the lives and they think how horrible that is, and that these places shouldn't exist. Right? But they're comparing it with their own life. And no one in that slum had the option of going back to New York City and living in their duplex or whatever it is. Right? They have the option of living in rural poverty in India or living in rural poverty in the northeast of Brazil. And for them, living in a peri-urban area in Sao Paulo beat that. Right? Was better than that. And we should in some sense respect that, at the same time fighting to make those areas more livable, more humane, better places of opportunity. When I think about the built environment, I think of there as 2 twin dragons, Scylla and a Charybdis, that countries fall into when it comes to the physical environment. One of which is Nimbyism, not in my backyardism, excess zoning, excess regulations, excess historic preservation, saying no to everything. This is particularly an Anglo-Saxon curse, okay? But it shows up in lots of different ways as well. I mean, and it's something very much we feel in the U.S., right? Particularly the coasts, not necessarily in Texas. It's very common in London. But it becomes tragic when India decides to imitate the British Town and Country Planning Act of 1948. Now, the idea that any town and country planning regulations that are appropriate for Yorkshire in 1950 would be appropriate for Mumbai is insane. Right? It's absolutely insane to think that you would want to imitate British town and country planning in a country as poor as India in the same time period. What you have is that Mumbai, one of the mega cities of the world, a place that desperately cries out for more physical space, more good structures, has labored under some of the most draconian land use restrictions for 50 years. Floor area ratio maxima in central Mumbai typically average about 1¼ stories. So you could build to 1¼ stories. And this was partially abetted by city planners, by city leaders who wanted to stop the growth of Mumbai. So I began with this view that it was, a terrible mistake to think we wanted to stop the growth of cities. One of the reasons it's the mistake is when you try to do it, you often adopt very counterproductive policies like this. So consequently, instead of building up, Mumbai sprawls out. Right? Commutes are horrendous, of course. Hundreds of people die relating to commuting every year. And it's a city in which there's no possibility for the sort of dense, high-rise living that would enable pedestrians to get towards one another. This is one curse. There's another curse, though, and I've chosen a place which is pretty safe to make fun of, which is Astana in Kazakhstan, which is filled with monuments to the leadership. Right? And this is the other mistake that is made, is building for the sake of building, rather than for the humanity that inhabits that. Building sort of large structures for the sake of large structures. Now, Astana is not the most important case of this. The case in which I think there's far more socially costly monumentalism is China. Now, this is the US. This is over the past 20 years. Along the horizontal axis is distance to the city center. Along the vertical axis is growth in housing prices. And what you see is that really all of the big growth in housing prices is at the city center. That reflects two things. This switch in demand for proximity to the urban core. Right? The fact that in 1970 people were running away from cities, and in 2010 they're running back for all of the joys and pleasures that we get from being close to one another in urban areas. But also, it's about the difficulty of building. It's about the fact that out here, you can actually build new homes, and in here you can't. Right? And it's when robust demand collides against fixed supply that we see prices go through the roof. Now, one of the consequences of American opposition to growth, which is not evenly spread, is that we build in the wrong places. A sensible building policy would add density, would add new structures in the places of America that are most productive. Right? The coastal cities, the places that are actually greenest, which are also the coastal cities, particularly California. But no, they don't, because those are the areas that are most hostile to building. Instead, where do we add new housing? Perfectly good places, but places that have certainly much lower incomes, like Houston, Texas, like Dallas, Texas, like Atlanta. I mean, you don't understand why Atlanta, Dallas, Houston, and Phoenix each added 1 million people between 2000 and 2010 without understanding that they make it very easy to build mass-produced affordable housing. You may not necessarily want to live in those places, but you cannot deny that they do an extraordinary job of providing affordable housing to middle-income Americans, and they do it by unleashing private development. Now, I thought this was just an American thing. I thought this was just what happened when you had Nimbyism that was particularly centered in productive places. This is the exact same graph for China. This is not Nimbyism. This is monumentalism. This is the fact that the leadership of China's regions are judged on what they do to GDP. And either you get GDP by having real economics, or you know how else you can get GDP? You just build a lot. Okay? You build a lot, whether or not anyone wants it or not. You build a lot to add to your GDP, and you don't have to sell it even. You just measure it in GDP at the value that you say that it is. So you can goose your GDP if you're a local leader just by building a lot. And consequently, of course, it's the leaders who are in the lowest income areas who have the strongest incentive to do this. It's also true that you get local revenues by taking land and selling it. So if you don't have alternative sources for revenues, this is what you do. It's often the wrong type of building, the wrong level of quality, in the wrong place, at the wrong time. Okay? And one of the reasons we see this is the massive growth of empty buildings. And you can go to a second or particularly a third-tier city, and you wander through these forests of empty skyscrapers. On one level, they are spectacular monuments to Chinese engineering. On the other level, they're a sign that something is badly wrong. Now, the reason why there are empty skyscrapers, there's actually two different reasons why there's emptiness. One of which is they're developers who have built them and have not sold them. And the reason why they're not selling them is that if they sold them, they would have to sell them at a loss. And unlike I assume it's in Brazil, it's the same as the US, if you're a developer who's borrowed money and you're sitting on a lot of empty buildings, the bank will make you sell the buildings, right? They're going to make you get your cash back. That's not how it works in China, right? Your bank is a public bank, it's a government-owned bank, and the bank does not want some collapse in housing prices. So the bank says, sure, we'll grant you forbearance. You can hold on to these things for a while. The other thing that's going on, and which is less of a problem, is the growth of empty buildings that are bought by investors who just buy and hold empty houses. And that's really interesting from a US perspective because we had lots of investment buying during the boom as well. But if you're an investor in the US, you bought it and you rented it, right? Because you were trying to get some of your money back. They don't rent it. They buy it and they hold it and it's empty. And that's what I mean by saying it's built at the wrong time. If you're going to buy an apartment, if you're going to build an apartment that's then going to stay empty for a decade, you shouldn't have built it then. You should wait 10 years before someone's actually willing to use it. And yet this is what this cocktail of incentives has created. Now, together with my co-authors, we've tried to simulate, given various predictions about income and supply growth, but what's going to happen to prices over the next 20 years, assuming that China becomes something of an ordinary country in terms of housing demand. And along this axis is predicted is different measures for income growth. So if you think income growth is going to be 10% per year, you're up here. If you think it's 5%, it's here. If you think it's 0, you're down here. And along here is how much the growth in new construction is going to be. And the dotted line will be what the construction has been over the past. So basically, this line is the 3% annual return threshold. So to get there, you need either monumental amounts of income growth, right, or a lot of shutdown of prices, of new supply. Given anything else, you're sort of stuck. And the point being that China's basically got a quandary. Chinese leaders have the ability to do something about this, but it's not clear what the right answer is. They can either continue to build as they currently have, in which case it is almost impossible to imagine a situation in which prices will not fall. Or they can radically cut back on the amount of new supply, in which case prices can stay robust, but they will shut down urbanization, they will cause massive construction employment, and that is a quandary. I will say one last thing that's actually really important when you think about housing bubbles more generally. The 250 years of housing bubbles and real estate bubbles in the US teach us one thing, which is it's very hard to predict what demand will be. But when you know something about supply, when you know how much it costs to build and produce a home, and when prices go way beyond that level of supply, then the bust is predictable. So I had no idea whether or not housing was overpriced on Park Avenue in New York in 2006. It's like a Park Avenue apartment, like a Belgravia house. It's like a Rembrandt. They're not making them anymore, so who knows what people are willing to pay for it. But a house outside of Las Vegas, there's no restrictions on land. There are no regulatory barriers. It costs $800 a square meter to build, right? And you can build as much as you want. When prices are suddenly $2,000 a square meter, $3,000 a square meter for the house, you know there's something wrong. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. It was the predictable bust. And that's when you think about housing bubbles, stay focused on the supply side. Stay focused on how easy it is to deliver the product. And that's exactly the same way you should think about China. The demons of density. The difficulty of actually dealing with people who live close to one another. The most important of those demons is contagious disease. And for centuries, the cities of the West had to deal with the fact that we kill each other by living close to one another, right? Unless we have decent infrastructure, unless we have clean water, unless we have sewerage. Boy born in New York City in 1900 could expect to live 7 years less than the national average. That was roughly the same number as in Shakespeare's London. New York did not become safe by accident. America's cities and towns were spending as much on clean water at the start of the 20th century as the national government was spending on everything except for the post office and the army. But infrastructure was required, but it was never enough. And as we think about the cities of the developing world, it is important never to think that it's just about engineering. Engineering is one part of the story. But simultaneously, there's the need for incentives and institutions. When I was a child, I was raised on a story of engineering triumphalism. That New York was filthy, and then the great engineers came and built an aqueduct, the Croton Aqueduct, which brought in the clean waters from upstate, and all of a sudden, New Yorkers could drink cleanly and they stopped dying. Now, how do you know this is a lie? Croton Aqueduct was opened here in 1842, right there, okay? For 25 years after the Croton Aqueduct was opened, New Yorkers continued to die of cholera epidemics. My great-great-great-great-grandfather died in the 1849 New York cholera epidemic, 7 years after this. And it would have been a surprise to him, as he lay on his deathbed, to learn that the Croton Aqueduct had solved all of New York's problems. Why did New Yorkers continue to die for 25 years after the aqueduct? The same reasons Africans continue to get cholera. Right? Because of even when the Millennium Development Account has built a nice water main into their city, because of the last mile problem. Because we build a water main and we then expect the poor people to then pay for the connections. And a connection is $1,000 in Zambia, and poor people's income averages $1,500 per capita, and they say, this doesn't sound like a very good deal to me. I'm not going to spend $1,000 for your connection, which means we've spent tens of millions of dollars for the water main, and we don't get the connection. There are only two ways of dealing with this that I know of, one of which is to subsidize it, which is incredibly expensive and will artificially induce people to come to the cities, and the other way, which is painful to contemplate, but it was how New York did it, is to penalize property owners who don't connect. So in 1866, and that's when you start seeing the decline, which is when the Board of Health was started, you started having legal penalties, financial penalties, for tenement owners who did not connect to the water. did not connect to the sewers. You had to have rules to actually make sure that people took care of their city. And that's a running point. And it reminds us that cities depend upon the rule of law to actually make people take actions that protect their neighbors. Now, this creates a whole host of problems when you don't trust the police. New York handled this by having an alternative inspection service that was answerable to doctors. It creates alternative, even worse problems when you don't know who owns the land. So one of the things is New York may have been poor in 1866, and it may have been corrupt as heck, as it certainly was, but you certainly knew who owned every property in New York City. Try doing this in a peri-urban area in Sao Paulo, or a peri-urban area in Africa. And it reminds us that property ownership, the case for property ownership, is not just the Hernando de Soto point about empowering the poor. It's also about being able to impose obligations on property owners. We often talk about, in terms of the achievement, just getting water connections. So even when you've solved the last mile problem, you've got the water connections, it's still not enough. Why? Because the water goes out all the time. In Zambia, you never have water after 5 p.m. That's a given. But the water goes out constantly. And together with Nava Ashraf, Bryce Steinberg, and Abe Holland, we've measured what happens to households when the water goes out. Okay? So again, you have to accept the idea that it's not random that one area gets more water outages than another, but it's kind of random that one area got a water outage on January 3rd and the other area got a water outage on April 6th. So you have to accept that that's random to think that this is a valid experiment. If you do accept that, I'll tell you that not only do you of course see more cases in local clinics of diarrhea of various forms and typhoid fever, both of which are waterborne diseases, which are probably not surprising because they switch when they don't have the water from the pipes to less clean alternatives. But you also see more respiratory illnesses. Why? What do you wash your hands with? Right? So if you don't wash your hands, if you don't clean yourself, you also get sick. Point about institutions. Where do the water breaks? So it turns out that the water company in Zambia gets paid in 2 ways. One of which is by meter, meaning per cubic meter of water that you're sold, they get more money. The second of which is households pay a fixed monthly fee. What we see in the data is the more meters, right, the more quickly problems are resolved, and the fewer the days of problems are. Okay? And it's a very clear story of incentives. The water company has a real incentive to make sure the water is flowing when they get to charge for it, where it's a fixed fee. They don't care. So they don't fix the water so it doesn't flow. And it reminds us that the institutions, the way that we pay for things, are crucial for actually solving some of these problems. We need to think holistically about how to fix these institutions to make them better. 2 last points. One of which is cholera today is not what it was 150 years ago. Cholera actually didn't even require antibiotics. It just requires the proper use of hydration therapy to actually stop people from dying from it. But there are other diseases, some of which are waterborne, that we solve with antibiotics. So in general, we die of far fewer infectious diseases. But what if by choosing in developing world cities like Hyderabad in India, which is where this is from, by choosing to deal with infectious disease, to deal with these water problems, not by providing decent water infrastructure, but instead by giving people lots and lots of antibiotics. And remember, this is India. This is the capital of antibiotics that are freely available at low prices everywhere. What if we are breeding antibiotic-resistant hyperkiller bacteria? So together with a former student of mine who's now a doctor at Stanford Medical School, and David Cutler, we've been looking at the presence of antibiotic disease resistance across mothers in Hyderabad. Now the crucial element here is these women came in to be examined not because they were sick, but because they were mothers. They came in there, so it's sort of like a census of them, rather than saying where did we see sick people come in, which is a problem if you use that, because wealthier people tend to come in more than poorer people do. So we did this. We used the same visual tools that we did before to see who lived near open water and who didn't, right? Who had water pits around. And what you see is the prevalence of this antibiotic-resistant disease, so this is just distance water. The places that were far away from water, there was none of it. It was all in the places that were close to water, which suggests that the choice of dealing with these diseases, not by fixing the water supply, but by just giving people pills, we may end up all paying the price for this. It is, of course, tempting to look at the problems of developing world cities, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, and just think these are intractable and we're going to give up and it's never going to work. I think one of the reasons to be hopeful is that cities aren't just about economics, they're not just about fun, they're not just about transportation, they're not just about disease. They're also about, at least I think, they're also about political change. I think there's a reasonable view that the road from dictatorship to democracy also runs through city streets. And we have good statistical evidence suggesting that dictatorships are more likely to be rebelled against the more urbanized the society is. Now, it's less clear that urbanization always leads to stable democracy. So the urban crowds in Tahrir Square certainly did help topple a dictatorial regime. It's less clear that we think that they've replaced it with a strong democracy. But I think the hope is that the civil society created in cities doesn't just serve to create economic productivity, but it enables a well-functioning society that will then discipline its leaders, that will then create a stronger democracy, that will then lead to a better city overall. And I think that's ultimately what we're fighting for. So I'm going to stop there and hand it over to my distinguished discussant. But again, thank you for your time.